Our lesson this coming Sunday, January the 19th, is entitled, Is Every Life Sacred? And it's going to be based now upon key verses from Psalm 139. And you're aware, Sunday school teacher, that every quarter there is one lesson on the sanctity of life, and this is that sanctity of life lesson. Now, the sanctity of life, though, is not only about abortion. There are some who think that that's the only issue, but really it is not. The sanctity of life means older people and would involve what's called euthanasia. There are some people who believe that, in other words, when the body outgrows itself, well, then merciful killing can be done. And some doctor years ago became famous because he would, in other words, help people die when they wanted to die. And it's not just about that, but also it would have implications for murder. It would have implications for the abuse and neglect of children. And by the way, I was stunned here a while back to find out how many thousands of teenage girls every year are either smuggled in the United States or sold in the United States, or runaway girls into sexual slavery and things like this. And so the lesson would have to do with all human life is important and not to be neglected or abused or killed. So the sanctity of life is not simply about the issue of abortion. It would include that, but it would include also caring about people that are hungry and people that are thinking. It's care that in God's eyes, every human life is important, and we ought to treat every human being as if they are God's property and therefore important. So it's bigger than just the issue of abortion. I have people ask me about abortion, but sanctity of life is more than the issue of abortion. Well, let's come then and look at the scripture itself. As I'm looking at the Bible that I have, the New American Standard, it says right under Psalm 139, God's omnipresence and omniscience. As you know, omnipresence means God being present everywhere. Omniscience would mean his knowing everything. So he's all present and knows all things. And then right under that, Sunday school teacher, in very small print, it says, for the choir director, a psalm of David. So it's believed that this is either written by David or it's a psalm dedicated to David. So the word of David can mean composed by him, dedicated to him, or concerns him, but believed to be one of David's psalms. And in it, the psalmist, if it's David, shows, in other words, the incomparable greatness now of God, but along with it, it teaches that God, David seems to say, he knows when my very embryo is developing. He knows my bones. He knows me inside my mother's womb. And so it pictures God's knowledge of us from the time that we're conceived until the time that we die. Now, the issue of abortion, like I say, is only one issue, but it is an important issue, Sunday school teacher, that has implications. Because there's been a great debate among Jewish scholars as well as Christian scholars as when does life begin? Does it begin the moment the female egg is fertilized by the male sperm, or does it begin, in other words, when the embryo actually has legs and arms and a head and things like that, or does it begin when the child is born, whatnot like that? It was interesting that some Jewish rabbis did not believe that the embryo was a true person until after birth and began to breathe, because as they read Genesis, God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and he became a living soul only when that breath of life, and they said a child inside the womb couldn't breathe, and therefore it wasn't a true person that was born. And when that air came in, that's when the Spirit of God came in. And of course, that's not all that widely accepted, but that was one view. But now David seems to say God knows me from the very beginning, even before I was born. But the logical conclusion is that if God knows and cares as our Creator, well, then we are God's creatures, and as such, we are, in other words, his special creature, and we ought to be treated as God's creatures, and we ought to treat all other people as his creatures. Now, with that introduction, let's look at Psalm 139, the first 6 verses. David says here that God has known him intimately, even when he sits down and when he sits, even in the monotonous everyday affairs. Sometimes when we stop out and think about it, that so much of life is just everyday routine. And David says, even in the routine, standing up, sitting down, wherever it is, even in the routine. Some people seem to feel that God's not present unless it's some kind of spectacular, sensational. I know some Christians who seem to think that God's not present until they go to church on Sunday morning and have a rip-roaring emotional experience. But no, David says he's with me even in the monotonous things of everyday life. Stand up, sit down, wherever I am, God is there with me. In verse 3 he says, when I travel or when I rest. In verse 4 he says, well, even before I speak a word, God knew what I was going to say. Now this is that omniscience. God's knowledge is there. And then in verses 5 and 6, he says that when God's hand is upon him, well, then God's knowledge was beyond David's understanding. It's greater than I can understand. Now, class, there is I say class, I'm sorry, I'm still an adjunct teacher, a Sunday school teacher. There are some who say that you can't know God. You can just know some information about God, but you can't really know him. There's a form of agnosticism that says you can't really know him. But David says his knowledge is greater than that, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have any knowledge, but his knowledge is limited, only partial. But partial knowledge is not necessarily false knowledge, it's just partial. In fact, Sunday school teacher, all human knowledge is partial. Now think about it. There's probably not a single thing that we know everything that can be known about. Probably everything we so-called know, we could know more than we know about it. We don't know everything about anything. And so it's all partial. But anyway, David confesses that his knowledge was beyond his understanding. But it didn't mean David didn't have any kind of knowledge. It was limited, but he acknowledged that God's knowledge was far greater than his. So the first part of the lesson focuses around verses 1 through 6. Now let's skip to verses 13 through 16. Skip to verses 13 through 16. Now here is where he talks about God putting him together while still in his mother's womb. So he sees that God is that force, that intelligent force that causes that fetus to grow within the body of the female. And David says, therefore I will praise God because I'm wonderfully made. He saw God as the one who really caused the child to be made. In verse 15, he says, even my very bones were built. The skeleton within the human body, within the mother's womb, even the forming of the bones that's there. I had a missionary medical doctor some years ago who taught at the seminary before he retired, before I retired. And he heard me do a thing that I call the creation chance of choice, in which I went through and memorized about 16 pages of scientific information showing how complex things are for life to exist on the planet Earth, and asked, can you believe these all happened by chance or by accident? And he said, I'd like to give you that much information on the human body. This was a medical doctor. He said, I think the human body and its complexity ought to be evidence that there's got to be some type of supreme intelligence, because there's no way all the blood vessels and the miles of nerves and the heart pumping blood and all the overlaying muscles and all the bones and all that, he said, is too intricate. No way it could have ever developed accidentally. He wanted to give me that information, but he passed away before he gave me all that information. He wanted me to have a companion sermon, then one on the universe and its complexity, and then one on the human body and its complexity. And that's what basically David is saying here. The human body is too complex. It is evidence of God doing this in that way. So he says, why? He knows my days. He knows how long I'm going to live, knows when I was born, knows when I'm going to die. He knows all about me. This is the omniscience then of God, is not. Now the third and last part of the lesson is built around verses 17 and 18 of Psalm 139. And David says, I confess that God's ways are beyond my understanding. It's difficult. God is so great, magnificent, whatnot. I confess to you that it is beyond my understanding. In fact, in verse 18, he says that he felt that God's thoughts then were more numerous than all the grains of sand on the entire planet Earth, and that God's thoughts were that great. And so he has a very marvelous view of the thoughts of God. Now, you see that parts of this lesson, Sunday school teacher, would deal directly with the issue of abortion, but it's bigger than that issue. Again, I would say it's the value of human life. Neglected children, abused children, young girls sold into sexual slavery, senior adults in bad health, or the starving, or the hungry, or the needy, the oppressed. It would have implications. because the sanctity of life is that every human being, whether black or white, brown or yellow, whatever country, whatever age, every human life is God's doing and therefore is important and valuable, and we ought to treat all human beings then as they are the creatures of God, and if they are, treat them with respect. Now, it have implications not only for abortion, but for murder and for neglect and for abuse, and yes, even for bullying. There's a problem right now going on in our society about bullying in school systems and even in athletics. And so this lesson, the sanctity of life, would have to do with bullying. Bullying has no place. If every human being is important to God, well, then there's no place for one human being bullying another human being, as well as not killing them or mistreating them or doing anything like that. So it's broader than just the issue of murder and abortion. The sanctity of all human life, then, in this way. Well, with that examination of Psalm 139, let's look back over the lesson. One observation that I make is that a human being is too intricate. A human being is too complex to have developed accidentally. Surely there must be an intelligent God who created us in that way. And so even the complexity of the human body that I referred to earlier, that's one implication that there must be that way. Had a boy one time who's kind of wanted to say, well, that, you know, it could just happen accidentally if you have enough time. And I just said, well, let me give you a paint bucket and put a brush in the paint bucket and sling it against the wall, and then stick your paintbrush in there and sling it and hit every drop on that wall exactly with no additional ink spots, paint spots. And do that a third time. Don't let anything hit except where it's already hit, and do that about 1,000 times. Do you believe you can do that? He said, well, no way. I said, well, but look, you've got billions of cells that reproduce exactly like themselves, and a human being would have a human being, and a goat would have a goat. They're reproducing just like, and you can't even sling accidentally paint on a wall. You'd have a different pattern. You can't throw a group of dice on there and those dice turn up every time unless you cheat and devise a system in that way. I said, you can't even do everyday things accidentally, and then you believe something as complex as a human brain, as a human heart, as a human circulatory system developed accidentally. Son, you don't understand the type of gullible faith that you have to believe. To think that unintelligence can do something that intelligent, is more intelligent to believe that intelligence did it. And that, in a sense, reflects what David is saying here, that life is too complex in that way. Now, let's remember that David lived about 1,000 years before Christ lived, and David realized, as others before him, that God existed, and the evidence of the human fetus itself reflecting the of God. Now, if God created us, then we are important, and every human being is valuable according to this, so there are no unimportant human beings. Every human being is important, ought to be treated then as a valued person then in that way. Well, that being the case, it has implications for many things in life. If everyone lived according to this, there'd be no, in other words, enslaving of human beings. There'd be no trapping of young girls into slavery. There'd be no human trafficking. There would be none of this. There'd be none of that. What a difference it would make. Well, God bless you as you teach this lesson this coming Lord's Day.